Can overlanding be a pilgrimage? This video explores the relationship of modern overlanding and the concept of a religious pilgrimage, both the historical practice of pilgrimage and its modern context. For my wife and me, there's a lot of overlap, and vocation aptly describes for us our vacations with a purpose. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about this type of pilgrim. For many of us Americans, the word pilgrim invariably gets mixed with the early religious settlers in New England. No, I'm referring to religious travelers, people who journey in pursuit of religious enlightenment and blessings from God. Those who landed at Plymouth Rock were truly pilgrims, but not in a very narrow sense. So next up is, well, what is overlanding, if that's what a pilgrim is? I don't want to engage in the endless debate about what overlanding is and isn't, but for me, overlanding involves vehicle-based travel, accommodations that embed the traveler with unfamiliar lands and peoples, and some purpose, maybe adventure, maybe experiencing beauty, and hopefully also expanding horizons, growing as a person, and making the world a little bit smaller and more familiar. One way for us that overlanding becomes a pilgrimage is simply attending religious services as we normally would, but instead of going to our neighborhood church, we attend a house of worship near the areas where we're camping. Sometimes it's just getting to know slight differences in local religious practices and hearing interesting homilies from different priests from different backgrounds, whereas sometimes it's actually traveling to a place with a religious significance and praying and meditating and reflecting on it as we travel. One habit I've tried to form is taking a little bit of video each time we visit a church in one of the areas where we're having an overlanding adventure. So in this sequence are a number of churches, one in rural Missouri out in the Ozarks from a trip to Eminence, Missouri, St. Charles Borromeo in Rapid River, Michigan, which is near where our land is in the UP, a church in Belt, Montana, from when my wife attended Montana Fiddle Camp, and then finally a church that was outside of Spokane, Washington, a little ways west. Sometimes the overlanding trip itself is a sort of a pilgrimage. In this particular trip, I was visiting our land and working on our land up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. While I was there, I made a point of taking a day to drive east along the peninsula, trying to visit and gain some insight into some of the travels of Père Marquette, a French Jesuit at the time when that part of, Canada, the United States now, was a French colony. And Père Marquette was a fascinating historical figure who traveled through much of the upper Midwest in the hope of spreading the gospel among the Native Americans. So this was an example where an overlanding trip basically was a pilgrimage. It was me going on pilgrimage to see some of the historical Père Marquette sites and hopefully to gain a deeper understanding of the spirituality of the French Jesuits and some of the early Native American converts. All right, just realized I never properly drank my morning coffee this morning. So that was quite the ordeal. I had $7 on me. I think it's an $11 day pass. So I put my $7 in, grabbed an extra envelope, and I'll mail them the difference. Needless to say, here on Memorial Day, this was not a popular tourist destination, at least not here at 4 p.m. So I've actually killed more time than I should have. I'd really like to have been on my way back just because I want to get summer camp torn out, put away tonight. For those of you unfamiliar with the history, Père Marquette, a French Jesuit, along with de La Salle, businessman, venturer, whatever you want to call him, went on an expedition down the Mississippi River. This is St. Ignace. This is sort of the mission town that he had founded. I believe it was at that point the Illinois Federation. The Ojibwa, probably pronouncing that incorrectly, are the local tribe. I don't think they were part of the Illinois Confederation, but I'll have to do some research on that before I publish this video. So again, as they point out, Michigan was part of New France, and it was a wilderness. A day like today, so full of mosquitoes. Yes, so Father Marquette, a missionary. There you go, the Kaskaskia, yep. In Illinois. There's some a lot of good internet videos that give a pretty good accounting of his voyage down the Illinois. It is quite amazing to contemplate some Native American guides, De La Salle and Marquette, with a small group of people in a few canoes going from here all the way across Wisconsin down the Mississippi River, and they only stopped because they were warned they'd probably run into Spaniards, so they turned around and went back. Father Marquette again founded St. Ignace. Interesting, Huron and Ottawa. I don't know if Ottawa is a modification of Ojibwa, but I thought most of those with him were of the Illinois Confederation. I don't recall if the Huron or Ottawa tribes were members of the Illinois Confederation. Yep, there you go. First European to map the Mississippi River. Yeah, reburied in his mission. Some discussion about exactly where and how he died. I believe it was on the trip back. Again, if you're from the Chicago area, there's a lot of history there. There's a portage where you can go from the what we now call the Chicago River. Its direction was reversed in the, is it the Des Plaines or the Fox? I think it's the Des Plaines River. In any event, the other river runs right nearby. You can cross over. The Chicago River flowed into Lake Michigan. The other river streams down the Mississippi, and there was a relatively narrow portage that the Native Americans showed them. So really an extraordinary tale of their journey down the river. So we'll head out, see what they have at the actual memorial. Might get a better peek of the Mackinac Bridge here as well, not sure. Interesting. Little discussion of the straits. And there is the bridge. Try and zoom in a little better on that. Well, apparently that's the best the GoPro can do for me. So there you have the straits and the bridge. Lake Michigan, Lake Huron. Memory serves. It was like $4 or $6 toll to cross it. So here you get into a little bit of French-Canadian history. Remember as a kid, it was a 7 Years' War, I think we called the French and Indian War. Some discussion about New France never really took off in the way the English colonies did. It's a very different thing. I don't know if it's because the French didn't want to move to the New World, but it was mostly fur traders who moved here. So with less population and a flow of wealth, the French established much stronger alliances with the native peoples. They offered less of a threat since they weren't really trying to take as much of the land. But the practical upshot was New France never had the wealth or the number of people as the English or Spanish colonies, and therefore kind of eventually shrank to modern day Quebec, which of course became part of the British Empire. It's actually an even more impressive view here. Talk a little bit about the journey there. Well, this is a somewhat better view of the bridge. Talks a little bit about the mission that was established in St. Ignace, so 1671. Yeah, there you go. Who called themselves the Anishinabeg, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. I don't know about the Hurons. Tayanatate, not sure how that's pronounced. A lot of interesting aspects of Native American history. It was a friend who explained to me that Sioux, she was half Lakota. She said that's actually an insulting French name for the tribe, that the tribe called themselves Lakota, not Sioux. Can't remember what Sioux translated, but it was not flattering. Alright, here's where I began the trail. This is that last little signpost. I went the other way, and you can kind of end here. Ojibwe, Huron, and Ottawa. Apparently the Native Americans associated with the area. That's a fair summary. Soldiers and traders, explorers and priests. So certainly the Jesuits were here on a religious mission. But again, New France, if you like. New France never really took off. And ultimately, of course, Napoleon needed money. Thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. And that was the end of that. Someday I'll study more of the history of the Quebecois. I guess I don't really know how they felt when New France just became part of the British Empire and ultimately part of Canada. Obviously, to this day, there's still controversy about preserving the French language where I work. When we provide samples anywhere, at least in Quebec, it has to have French as well as English. One of my favorite channels is Epic Family Road Trip. They're up north by James Bay, and their videos they're releasing now, and they kind of confirmed, as I suspected, there are certain areas there where it's hard to get by with English. They were managing it from what I could see in the videos. But I was always warned, at least 20 odd years ago or so, if you go into rural Quebec, it's going to be hard to get by with only English. So, a little glimpse into the history of Father Marquette and the French Jesuits. Beginnings of New France, which ultimately affects the history affected the history of the area where I live, where the Illinois River meets the Des Plaines and Fox Rivers. One of the places where Père Marquette landed. Oh, interesting. Time capsule. I edit the video, I'll try to remember to put in where LaSalle fit into this. Honestly forgotten, but it was Joliet who was with Père Marquette. So, for example, in the areas where I live, many things named for Joliet, like Joliet, Illinois. I'm sure I mispronounced it, like Joliet or something in proper French, but lots of things named for LaSalle, like the neighboring town. I live in Peru, Illinois. Right next to us is LaSalle, Illinois, and many things named for Marquette. Especially religious institutions, for example, the Catholic school in, I guess it's actually in Ottawa, Illinois, is Marquette Academy. So quite the mix of French and Native American names in the area where I live. Finally, then I'll close out this video with what was by far the most extraordinary overlanding trip I ever undertook. But at the time I would not have described it as an overlanding trip. It was an adventure that my wife and I undertook at all of our major anniversaries, every 5-year anniversary, at least since our 20th, we've tried to do something significant. And on this trip, we went on a complex trip of genealogy, religious pilgrimage, and just general adventure, visiting members of our extended family. In this case, we started in the UK, visited cousins on both sides of the family in London and then in Cambridge. Then went to Krakow, Poland, which is very significant in the history of my father's side of the family, the Jagiellons or Jagiełowiczes. And then into Lithuania, where I had planned to do more genealogy research on my father's side, but actually learned amazing things on my mother's side. In fact, one wonderful relative, Kostya, just passed away a couple of days ago. And there, it was just such an extraordinary religious experience. We saw the Hill of Crosses. We completely stumbled across a beautiful site where there was a Marian apparition, and there was nobody there. Like, there's times when it's so crowded, and we literally just drove up and saw whatever we wanted. That overlanding trip, we completed the entire trip in a rented Volkswagen station wagon. So as people point out, overlanding doesn't necessarily require an earth roamer. One of the most wonderful and memorable and truly profoundly spiritual trips I ever undertook was that trip in Lithuania with my relatives on both sides of my family. Some of my father's cousins came over from Poland, and we just drove around beautiful, amazing places in a rented Volkswagen station wagon. Part of the fun was my cousin Donatas speaks English, Russian, of course Lithuanian, his native language, and a bit of German. My relatives on my father's side who joined us spoke only Polish and a smattering of English and a smattering of Russian. So poor Donatas tried to keep the conversation going by keeping us all, to some extent, comprehending one another. But again, overlanding can be a deeply religious experience, even in the case of just randomly stumbling across some amazing religious sites in a rented station wagon. And finally, I'll just end that part of the adventure. As we were driving through rural Lithuania, places where my cousin, even having lived there, never knew they existed, we stumbled across some mendicant Franciscan missionaries. And mendicant basically means they sing for their supper. And they were just walking down the gravel road. And then we found this wonderful historical site in one of the nearby towns from a 19th century Polish language, it was Lithuanian, Nobel laureate. And then they wandered up to the same church, so we got to meet them more in depth after saying hello on the road. So again, just a wonderful and extraordinary adventure. So this is the challenge for my wife and me now. How can we more thoroughly incorporate this concept of a religious pilgrimage into our overlanding adventures? And as we have more ideas and more experiences, of course, we'll share them here on this channel.